Right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Could you turn off your video, please? Our camera's not working. That would help. Thank you. Okay, so the sound has been a bit faulty up to this point as well. So I was just saying that when the Old Testament was translated into Greek is a more verbose language, a bit like English, uses lots of words, and it simply wouldn't fit anymore, so they had to split it into two scrolls. And the death of Saul was taken as the division point, which makes perfect sense within the scheme of the story. So at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 31, 1 Samuel chapter 31, it's a short chapter that simply recounts the defeat of Israel at the hands of the Philistines and the death of Saul. And I'd just like us to have a quick recap of what actually happened. The Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled for the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men on the same day together. And then the men of Israel flee. The Philistines come, cut off Saul's head, and they parade it in their cities, and and strip his body, fasten his body to the wall of one particular town. And they also occupy various Israelite towns. So that's what actually happened. This was the end of Saul's reign.
Saul's sons, didn't they have children of their own?
Yeah, they were adults.
So they weren't killed when the sons were killed?
They were not if they weren't. They were people who were killed in battle.
All right, but they must have had younger children as well at that time.
Well, we don't know any details, but we know that whoever was there, those people who were in battle were affected, not anybody else. They didn't come and sort of seek out anybody else.
Oh, that's
So that's where we got to last time, and that is the the setting now for where we pick up. Now, at this time, while this is happening, something else is happening simultaneously, which is that David has been on a raid against the Amalekites, who, while he had been with the Philistines, had come and stolen, taken all the wives and children and the cattle with them. David's come home, found them gone, pursued them, rescued their wives and their children, and has then fought against the Amalekites and struck down a great many of them. The younger men fled on camels, but he was victorious in battle against them. This is happening at the same time as this battle. So David is nowhere to be seen during the battle. Okay, so that's the setting. Let's read now. So 2 Samuel chapter 1, and if we could read the first 16 verses, please. Rosemary, do you want to get us started?
Okay. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the 3rd day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes from the dirt on his head.
Clothes torn.
Torn, sorry.
Yeah.
And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him, And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. And I answered, Here I am. And he said to me, Who are you? And I answered him, I am an acolyte. And he said to me, Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the amulet that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, Where do you come from? And he answered, I am the son of a sojourner of Amalekite. David said to him, How is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Then David called one of the young men and said, Go, execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, Your blood is on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed.
Okay, thank you. So this is a few days afterwards. David has returned to Ziklag. You will remember, I hope, that Ziklag was the town that the Philistines gave to David and his followers as a base, as their sort of home base, and he's returned there. And so on the third day, this happens. It doesn't say it's the third day from David's return or the third day from the battle, but it's roughly about the same time. Now, any thoughts that come from reading this or hearing this?
He's saying he killed Saul, whereas the previous we were told Saul killed himself, fell on his own sword.
This is a bit unusual, is it? Is it what he was seeing, or he was telling David something he wanted to keep secrets and told David something different?
Well, he's clearly telling David something different from what was told by the Bible. Now, here's a little rule of thumb for the narrative, the accounts of the histories in the Bible. When this history is told us by the kind of the narrator, the text itself, we can always assume that's the truth. We can always assume that what's been narrated as having happened is what happened. What we can't assume is that when we have quotations of what people were saying, that those things are necessarily true. It is true that he, like this Amalekite, it is true that he said it. But is what he said true? And those are the two different things. So we have been told by the narrator, by the text itself, that this is what happened. This is how Saul died. We can take that as our baseline, as I take it for granted. Okay, this is what happened. Now we compare what he said to what the text said happened, and then we have to say, well, okay, so are they saying the same thing? If they're not saying the same thing, is there a reasonable way to marry the two? Says, okay, so the text tells one thing, he tells the same thing from a different perspective, or is there a contradiction between the two? And that's an generally important point, because there are passages in Scripture, for example, where things are told several different times just different angles. Just let me finish a moment. In the book of Acts, for example, Saul's conversion on the road to Damascus is narrated several times, once by the text, once by Luke, and then Paul himself retells the story several times. None of the accounts is identical with each other. There are slight differences. The resurrection of Jesus is told 4 different times by the 4 different Gospels, as is the Last Supper, as is Jesus' crucifixion. None of those accounts is identical with each other. And so the question is, well, how do these fit together? And with those New Testament examples I just gave you, it's not that difficult to fit them together. there are some bits where there are sort of little wrinkles are left in terms of what's the exact timeline and so on. But you can say, well, they are all telling the same thing, but they're telling it from the very differences increase our confidence in the truth of the text, because when you read 4 different accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, for example, if the thing was made up in the first place, you'd expect 4 pretty similar accounts. But the fact that they're different is just, these are probably eyewitness accounts. If you take, if I ask you all to go home after this Bible study and write down what happened in Bible study, and we compared your accounts, they wouldn't be identical. If they were, I would say, you've been sharing notes,
Yeah.
and you'd be in trouble, right? And so that's always an important thing to remember. In this case, we're not comparing 2 biblical accounts of the same thing. We are now comparing what the Bible itself says and what a character within the Bible says. Okay, and it will take us about 5 seconds to realize, as you've already noted, that what he's saying and what the text earlier said are not the same thing. In one account, you've got 2 characters there: Saul's death. You've got Saul and his armor bearer. He asks the armor bearer to kill him. Armor bearer refuses, and so Saul kills himself. He falls on his own sword. In the second account, now there is no armor bearer at all. There's this hapless Amalekite who just happens to be on Mount Gilboa in the middle of a battle by chance. Gets into this conversation with Saul. Saul says, come over here, I've got something, I've got a favor to ask you. And then he kills Saul. And those 2 things, I would suggest, can't both be true at the same time.
I have one thought. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That now this Malachite, he'll be there to tell this to David, so that he would thinking that, now he's going to be very, very happy, and I will get the reward because of this good thing that I did.
Yes, I mean, it would seem that the way that he's acting is calculated to bring him favor from David. He's currying favor with David, and he's hoping it to be of advantage to him. And you see this from the fact
that he decided that it was better for him to lie than not to.
Well, he could have just stayed at home and done nothing. He chooses to travel all the way to the Philistine territory. He brings Saul's crown and bracelet and tells the story. And why would he be doing this? I mean, strictly speaking, this has nothing to do with David. David's with the Philistines. He's no longer in Saul's court. Why is he doing this? He's presumably calculating that David's going to be the next person, the next person in line for the throne, and he'd better get in early, which is standard behavior in politics, in courtly politics. It rather misfires on him for reasons that we will see as time goes on. It is interesting that if you look at verse 1, that David had been striking down the Amalekites. Now, these Amalekites who are outside the boundaries of Israel, they are, if you like, they're a foreign nation, but they are identified as the people whom David has been fighting against up to this point, which, of course, our young man wouldn't have known. And on the 3rd day, this man comes, and he said, with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. Why is that?
Well, he's pretending that he's very, very sorry what has happened.
Yeah, these are signs of grief. Yeah, it's a kind of sackcloth and ashes type, similar sort of things. So it was customary even in Jesus' time. It's an ancient custom in this days. You tear at particularly shocking or sad news, you would tear your clothes. You'd sort of take your outer garment and rend it, and that was like an visible sign. And then you put dust on your head, which is a sign that you are in grief, in shock. Now, he, as we learn, is not an Israelite, but he is identifying with Israel's grief at the death of Israel's king. And that, as we will see why that is in a moment. But from his behavior and from the account, it's not obvious yet to anyone that he's anybody other than one of them, an Israelite. And he comes to David and said he fell to the ground and paid homage. When we say he fell to the ground, what are we talking about?
Yeah.
Or possibly prostrated himself.
On the floor, flat.
Yeah.
Honor on mine, which
Yeah, so yeah, it's it's the this is the sort of behavior you're expected to engage in the presence of a king. It's the sort of thing when you watch historical drama by the Tudors, and you know everybody as they leave the room with a king, they kind of bow and they keep bowing and they walk backwards and that sort of thing. It's a similar sort of thing, but you say you are expressing with your body language that you acknowledge the royal authority of the person or the authority of the person in whose presence you are. And this is a good time for me to remind you that the word that we usually use in our setting called worship, if you trace it back to the Old Testament, means this. It doesn't mean a state of mind in the first and foremost. It certainly doesn't mean to sing like it often does. We're going to have a time of worship in some churches, at least. Time of worship means time of singing. It doesn't mean that you are engaging kind of a super spiritual activity. The word worship that we now translate as worship, its original meaning is to prostrate yourself before somebody. That's what it means. And paying homage, which is why one of my hobby horses, I've said this many times in Bible studies before, but I'll say it again because it's a hobby horse, which is that when we in our current setting, when we don't and don't tell me about your knees, I know about your knees already, but when we don't kneel, when we don't bow down, when we don't prostrate ourselves, our words and our actions are actually in contradiction with each other. Because, for example, in Matins we sing, let us worship and bow down, let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. And what's our body language at that point? We stand bolt upright, let us worship and bow. No, we won't. We'll just say it. But and in fact, as you know, I'm a big fan of trying to get our words and our actions always to match.
But your mind can be doing that.
Of course it can, but that's not what it means.
Yes.
And what I'm saying, it's not, it's not that. My point isn't to say that as long as you do the right bodily actions, everything is done, or that's all that matters. But what I'm saying is that, like in everything that we do in all communication, when our bodies match our words and our thoughts, then our words and our thoughts are far more likely to actually get our own attention. And each other. When I was at school, I'm sure it was the same when you were at school, is when the head teacher came to the room, or any adult came to the room, everything stopped, you stood up.
Yeah.
Now, you could say, well, as long as you're thinking your head teacher must be respectful, ultimately what you wanted is respect for the teacher, but actually the bodily action drummed it in. So your body taught your mind how to think about it by your very actions. And I as you know, I think there's a great deal of wisdom in that, in all sorts of settings of life, not just. But I think it's particularly important in things spiritual, especially when we do things that are repetitive, like in the liturgy we often do, is that we kind of draw our own attention to things by doing this, like when we stand up and we sit down, as the basic things. And these things are designed to express. And God doesn't need this from us, but it's good for us. If I come and prostrate myself before you, whether you care about it or not, I'm telling myself something, and I'm training myself to think of you in a particular way. And it's the same thing with our worship. Anyway, that's a little footnote on those words.
Is that something you'd like us to do?
And something that I would encourage you to do.
Yes,
for your benefit. Well, you can. Everybody can do something.
Yeah, I can get off the floor.
I already told you. I know about your knees, so I'm not. But it's a bit like saying that you're saying that for example that everybody should get plenty of dairy and vegetables and meat and things in their diet because it's good for you. So, well, I've got lactose intolerance. Yeah, well, okay, so you can't. That's an exception, but that doesn't change the rule. And in the same way that we should do these things. If somebody's in a wheelchair, well, that's an exception. to the rule, but then you might find a different way of doing it. All I'm saying is that it's beneficial.
Mm.
It's beneficial because it teaches, if you like, we use our bodies to train our minds.
Well,
But-
it was nearly 60 years.
Good, carry on.
I can't do it now.
Or you can do things. There are things that one can do.
Mm.
But as I said, that's just a footnote to this. So at this point, the man he's expressing, he's demonstrating with his body language that he acknowledges David's authority, so royal authority, and makes himself a subject to David. And so he's already giving us a clue of what's going to come, why he's come to David, why he's approaching David, and why he approaches him in this particular way. So David says, where you come from? And he said to him, I've escaped from the camp of Israel. And that very word escape already gives us a clue that things are not happening. Now, why has he escaped? Is he a deserter? Has he escaped because, well, we know why he's escaped. It's an escape because the camp
Everyone else is being killed.
Camp of Israel is in turmoil. Camp of Israel has been routed. And so David he now has an eyewitness of the battle. And David, of course, knew about the battle because he was about to go into it with the Philistine lord until the last minute when he was sent home. How does he go? Tell me. And now we get this account. Keep in mind the account of the battle that we just read at the end of the previous chapter. The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead.
In the previous one, it said that the other son as well. He didn't mention
Okay, good, well spotted. So first of all, it doesn't mention any other sons of Saul.
So that means he might not have seen it because he wasn't sure. But
Well, we'll the first thing to say is that this is vague. This is quite brief. And of course, we don't expect necessarily to say, like, at 9 o'clock we got up and had bacon and eggs for breakfast, and then we put, you don't want a blow by blow account, but there are a couple of really, really important details missing here. One is the sons of Saul, the other sons of Saul. There's no mention of the occupation of Israelite towns by the Philistines. And it's a general account that does not necessarily need to be an eyewitness account. This is really broad, the sort of thing that you might have read in the newspapers, as it were. All of it is true, but it's not particularly, sort of vivid. I was there and it was terrible. Now, key point, how do you know? Verse 5, he says to the young man who told him, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan had it? David already seems to be suspecting, be suspicious about, well, how does this man, he doesn't sound like somebody who was there. He doesn't say, I saw Saul die or I saw Jonathan. How do you know? There's not a rumor. Very important question, that. It's very easy to pass on misinformation simply by taking things for granted and not asking the right questions. I don't know if any of you ever watched or still watch Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister. There's one particular episode where the Jim Hacker, the minister, he's managed to basically get his name in the papers. The civil service, they put out there's been a little bit of manipulation of the press, and there's a lovely report about him, how he's done excellent work, and he's got a little bit like, oh, I can't believe this is true, and the Sir Humphrey, the civil servant says, well, it must be true, it's in the papers. And it's easy to have that attitude, it must be true, it's in the papers, and David is wiser than that. So I need to know, I need to have grounds for confidence in your report. And the young man then gives us this account. Now, at this point, just press pause on this. This is the second time since we started this long Bible study series that we've had a messenger from the battle. Can you remember the first one?
No,
Very long time ago now.
it is.
It was the messenger who came back to Eli when the Philistines defeated the Israelites and the ark was taken. Remember, and Eli, the high priest, heard the news his sons were dead, and he fell backwards and broke his neck. That's different.
Mm.
That's not the same account.
All right.
No. So you know, it was this when Eli, he died as a result, and Eli's daughter-in-law went into labor and died, and you know, it was all a terrible disaster. Now, these two accounts are very similar. In fact, they're so similar that it's very likely that they are deliberately told in such a way that we notice the similarity. In 1 Samuel chapter 4, we have a messenger who comes from the battle to tell Eli, you know, comes, and Eli says, "Who are you? Where have you come from?" And he says, "You know, I come from the battle. How did it go?" And he tells him, "Your sons are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." And Eli dies as a result. His sons have just died, and his daughter-in-law dies in the childbirth where she goes into as a result of the news. And it's the kind of beginning of is the fulfillment of the prophecy that was given to Samuel that the house of Eli will be wiped out. It's the end of the house of Eli. Although there are a few survivors, they kind of it's that they are no longer the priestly line. In the same way here, we have the end of the line of Saul. Saul is dead, and his sons are dead. As it happens, not all his sons are dead, as we know yet. But it's in the same way that Eli's household, it wasn't an immediate, everybody's dead, but it's the beginning, it's the kind of the death knell, if you like, death blow to the family. And here we have the same thing. The house of Eli has fallen, now the house of Saul has fallen. But there is a significant difference. And that difference, you have to kind of read the text in Hebrew to really get the subtlety. But in 1 Samuel chapter 4, the word that is used of the person who brings the news is the messenger. And the way that word, this is not something that I have kind of pulled from my head. I had to learn this from a book because my Hebrew isn't good enough. But the word messenger, the way that is used in the Old Testament tends to imply that they bring the truth. They are simply passing on the facts. That's what a messenger does. In this account, this man is not called a messenger. In English, it's not translated that way because it doesn't make sense. The word it's not good English, but he's called the teller, the one who tells things. Hence, we have like in verse 5. Then David said to the young man who told him. Then the young man who told him said, the one who told him he's the one who is the teller. But you're telling something, well, you might be telling the truth, you might be telling a falsehood.
But you don't probably know.
You don't know unless you have access to other lines of information. And so there is the similarity, but there's also a great difference.
So we do lots of these things now, don't we? Somebody might say something to us or pass it on, and then it gets spoken in because
Chinese whispers.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this is why we have to be very, very careful with things when we hear accounts, is to ask that question, David, how do you know? Is that the case? Is that really true? And who told you that? It's particularly important, of course, in political discourse. And when it comes to things that have a particular importance, they're trying to persuade you of important things. So I recently was listening to a radio program about this. Somebody saying a really, really good question to ask, especially if you're a student at school or university, but in life generally, said, when somebody tells you something as fact, is to ask that question, how do you know it's true? And they say, or be an alternative question says, who told you that? And why did they tell you that? Because often people have an axe to grind. There's a slant, and they might be telling you something, not because it's the neutral fact, but there's an agenda.
Another thing here is that he says the spear, and we know that Saul fell on his sword.
Yes, very good. Well spotted. You're good close reading there. Yes. So there's no mention of the spear in the other battle at all.
No.
Just a sword. Well, let's have a look. We haven't got to verse 6, so let's look at verse 6. The young man who told him, so he's the teller, not the messenger, said, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, And there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. Now, first of all, he says, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. Really? If he was fighting for Israel, it wasn't a case of being there by chance. He jolly well ought to have been there. If he wasn't fighting for Israel, why was he there in the first place? Was he there with the Philistines? Or what on earth is this young man doing? Is he having a nice little saunter with his dog, playing his pipe, and oh gosh, there seems to be a battle going around. This wasn't a kind of, sort of thing that you walk in the park and you see something passing. The top of this Mount Gilboa, which is a hill, is the scene of a bloody battle. How do you happen there by chance?
Well, he's already claimed to be escaping from.
And he's escaping,
So
yeah.
he wouldn't be hanging around.
No, this story is not holding together very well.
He's lying, isn't he?
Well, something's not right, put it that way.
I guess I suspect if I walked out today and said they had on their line that and all of them were white. I mean, it's because people think that they know it all when they don't know half of it, and so therefore they just.
But this bit, when he all of a sudden becomes this eyewitness, it goes from hearsay to actually fabricating seemingly the details to make his report more credible. There's a reference to the spear. The other thing is the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him, which again wasn't in the other account. There's a reason why they weren't in the other account. You try to run your chariots and horsemen on a hill, on hilly terrain. I mean, these are the sort of things you use on plains when you've got clear run of it, but on a kind of hilltop, less likely. So the whole thing seems a little bit. I mean, we can't know for certain, but it's got every sign of having been made up by somebody who wasn't actually there.
Added to what was there because it made it better.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and called to me, and I answered, "Here I am," which is a kind of, it's just a very polite way of saying, or kind of respectful way of saying that. Which is similar to, in fact, is what Samuel says to Eli. Here I am. And he said to me, "Who are you?" I answered him, "I am an Amalekite." And then, so we've got this whole conversation going. He said to me, "Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers." Or the other translation we have here is, "I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive." It's the trouble with that sentence is that there's the key thing there that is translated as anguish or throes of death occurs nowhere in any way. The Hebrew word only exists once in this place. We have to kind of guess what it means from the context. The Greek translation talks about darkness, kind of darkness taking hold of me, because we just don't know what that word specifically means. But you get the sense of it. He's clearly mortally wounded, but he won't die. So he's in terrible anguish, whether that's physical anguish, as is likely, or emotional or mental or spiritual anguish, which is also likely, or both. Both of them. He can't bear to live anymore. Compare this with what Saul actually says to his armor bearer. "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." He's not concerned with his pain and anguish. He's concerned with being treated dishonorably and tortured by the Philistines. He's not, I'm nearly dead, but I just won't die. I want to be out of my misery. So it's a it's a very different kind of account. And so what he's doing there. So it says, "I stood beside him and killed him because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen." He turns this into a mercy killing. It's an act of kindness. He's obeying the king's command out of mercy and kindness. And it says, and I took the crown that was on his head and the armor that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. Now, why would he bring them to David?
He thought David was going to be the new king.
That's clearly his calculation.
But I would say, how did he get hold of them?
Well, the idea is that they were on his head and on his arms. He took them
Yeah,
from
but
him.
he must have been there at some point then
Well,
to actually take those.
well, I see. Sorry, I misunderstood your. Yeah. Yes, so we don't know. So
No.
this is the intriguing thing, because of course the
Yeah.
Philistines got their chopped up. So somebody has taken, the Philistines don't have them, so somebody's taken them.
Yeah,
But his story of how he came about them,
yeah, it doesn't.
it doesn't match with what is known from elsewhere. What happens? So we have to. So there is a sort of question mark over everything. And anyway, who is he to decide who the next king of Israel is? I mean, he's an Amalekite. He's a young lad who just happens to be wandering the countryside and falls on the scene and said, "Oh, I know. I'll make and take this, and I'll choose the next king for Israel." Like, who? Who are you? Who gave you that authority? The whole thing is very, very odd and fishy. But he clearly thinks that by painting himself as having been kind and obedient to Saul up to the point of his death, on the one hand, but also paying homage to David and sort of boasting the fact that he brought about Saul's death. And here I am now presenting to you, you are clearly, I recognize this next king of Israel. He's hoping to gain from it. That's the only explanation I can think of. I can't think any other reason why he would behave in this way.
I mean, he could well have heard about David and recognised that he was likely to be the next king. But
Saul clearly seemed to think that David
Yes.
wasn't good, had a good chance of being the next king. Yes. Now here we get a little bit of parallel. We got the way that the story. So we get two things happening at once. So the time scale, if you like, the story backs on itself. Because next thing we have David mourning and fasting until evening, which doesn't mean that the things that happen next happen in the evening, but it's like this is what happened in the evening, but at the same time, at this very moment also, which I think is perfectly reasonable to expect that they wept and fasted till evening, but the response to the Amalekite took place straight away. So that he's saying two things at once. David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. Now, what might he have done perfectly reasonably, as far as we're concerned, when he heard that Saul was dead and the men with him?
well, he could have rejoiced
Because
Saul was his enemy, really.
Yes.
He persecuted him for long enough.
yes,
So
But then again, Jonathan was his friend.
yes, that's true.
Yes.
But he doesn't just mourn for Jonathan; he mourns for Saul and Jonathan.
Yeah, because Saul was God's anointed one.
Exactly. So David here, again, excuse me, David is here acting or reacting, not out of self-interest,
No.
but he's reacting out of deeply held conviction. Saul, for all his failings and his faults, and Saul, for all that Saul was pursuing David in enmity, was this Lord's anointed. And therefore, David held him in honor and reverence on account of his office, not on account of his conduct, not on account of his character, but on account of his office. Even though Saul's death was, directly speaking, selfishly speaking, directly advantageous to him, because he was rid of an enemy, and now yes, Jonathan was his friend, but Saul's sons are dead. The way to the throne has opened up. And there are plenty of examples in history of people who behave very differently. Frederick the Great of Prussia, the King of Prussia, great Marshal King of Prussia in the 18th century, while his father was alive, basically he had this extended bachelor life, and he basically, literally partied with his close group of friends day in, day out. They just led this dissolute, luxurious, hedonistic life. And there was this coterie of friends, and that's all they did. They read books, they sang songs, they womanized, they drank, they ate, they did all that sort of stuff. And there was this really close-knit group of friends. The moment he ascended to the throne, his friends thought, hey, now we really are going to have a fantastic time because now our mates on the throne and we're going to do this on a royal scale. None of it. He banished them from the court and cut them off and had no contact with them ever again. He said, I'm king now. I don't have time for those sorts of games. He was miserable with it. But, friendship counted for nothing. David's different. He doesn't react out of that kind of self-interest thing. Hey, it's all about me. Now I can really get this. My father-in-law, the king of Israel, the anointed one, and my friend, they're dead. And he weeps and he mourns. And they wept and they fasted for Saul and for Jonathan and his son, and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Lots of people had died. I have a relative who's a retired doctor, and she was a very, 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 very good medical student many decades ago, very promising student. And she was given the professor who's headed the medical school, kind of took her under his wing. And there's a patient in the hospital who was suffering with terrible symptoms, and nobody had managed to diagnose what was wrong with this patient. And so the professor gave to this relative of mine, said, you go and find out what it is. And she went and studied the patient and did all these tests and read books and after a tremendous amount of energy and effort, she managed to find out the diagnosis, which is very rare. It's a great triumph. She got there, and she rushed to the professor's side, knocked on them and said, I worked it out. It's this and this. And he said, how very sad. How very sad. And there's a kind of moment of realization. She said later, there's a moment of realization. This wasn't an interesting case and a personal triumph. This was a tragedy, which she had just diagnosed. And I am sure that made her a much better doctor than, well done, good, good job. That seeing constantly saying these things are, these things are, when these things happen, there's a great deal of suffering, a great tragedy, not just for David, for his loss of friend, but for the house of Israel. All these people have died. It's like when you watch something like, I don't know, Star Wars or James Bond or something like that, nameless people dying, there are dozens. Who cares? This is James Bond still alive. And has he got his woman? Every one of those people who've just been, who's just been killed or whose market store's been thrown upside down, that's their life. Stalin famously said that one death is a tragedy. 1,000 deaths is a statistic.
Is what?
A statistic.
Oh,
We kind of say it just becomes numbers.
yes. Yeah.
6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. Well, if we made it 6 million one, who'd care? Well, that person and their mother and brother and sister would. Every person. And there's this kind of here we see when David was a scoundrel in some ways, and he got into all sorts of mischief. But you see what kind of a heart he had been given by God. Very, very different. Very unusual for an ancient Middle Eastern king. And then comes the interrogation. David said to the young man who told him, where do you come from? And he answered, I'm the son of a sojourner, or NIV says alien, an Amalekite. Now, this is where these details are very important. What do we mean by a sojourner or an alien? Not trouble in the sense that we use the word.
So it's the foreigner, you're thinking.
Yeah, but what do we mean by that here?
Of no settled abode, going from town to town?
No. What it means is like what we might used to be called resident alien. So a foreigner who has settled in this land. like I'm a sojourner. I'm not a native of this land, but I've settled here. So that makes me a sojourner.
It's not used these days, though, is it?
No, it's kind of being reduced, left mostly to the Bible.
Mm.
But the idea is that he's an Amalekite, but his father at some point had settled in Israel. And if you read the Law of Moses, which I hope you do from time to time at least, you will find that there are also references to sojourners. And there are certain things that so basically the sojourners, these resident aliens, they were essentially treated like
Slaves.
let me tell you, they're like converts.
Oh.
They're like converts. They're considered that they are not Israelites, but they're treated like people who have adopted an Israelite identity. They might well be circumcised, and they were exempt from some bits of the law that Israelites were not, but most of the law did apply to them. And so, for example, at Passover, a sojourner also would be expected to take part of the Passover meal and to refrain from leavened bread. And of course, being a sojourner, then as now, often meant that people were more vulnerable than the resident, the natives of the land. And so they are often classed with sojourners, the widows, the fatherless, and sojourners. So when it comes to like the law about gleanings, which we come across in the book of Ruth, that when you harvest your field, don't go back over it and collect what you dropped, leave it. Same with the grapes. Once you harvest your grapes, don't go back and check if you left any. Leave it there for the widow, the fatherless, and the sojourner. So the presence of these foreigners who've settled amongst Israel is baked into the very law of God and into the law that was given to Israel, into the way they would live. And we have this at the very beginning almost, when Joshua leads the Israelites into the promised land, you got the people of Gilead who, by subterfuge, basically make a treaty with Joshua that they be spared. Now, they don't have equal status with the tribes of Israel, but they are allowed to live and they remain there and they become just part of Israel over time.
Are we not told in the New Testament to welcome sojourners at some point?
Yes.
Welcome.
That's it's a slightly different setting there.
Oh,
So
right.
because
Okay.
in the New Testament times, when the Roman Empire, which is a multi-ethnic thing, and there's a lot of movement of people, and but we are supposed, yes, already in the Old Testament you're told to welcome sojourners and to care for them, and in the New Testament all the more, especially if they are of the household of faith. Yes. So it becomes and in a sense, this is like the germ or the kind of seed of the proclamation of the gospel to the Gentiles. That already in the Old Covenant you have this, if a foreigner, say Ruth, or this man's father, wanted to make the kind of take their place and share the lot of Israel amongst Israelites and share the lot of Israel, that was an option, that was a possibility, and they were to be embraced into the life, and they had the protection of God's law, and they also had the God's law applied to them. And you say, well, where is the Gentile mission in the Old Testament? It's all about Israel, 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 Israel. Well, actually, Moses married a foreigner, and you have Joseph married an Egyptian, and his sons are in heads of tribes. And you've got Ruth, you've got this. It was there all along. And the Gentile, the proclamation of the gospel to the Gentiles is not so much about something, they've been completely radical new. God says, actually, I changed my mind. Let's have the Gentiles in after all. It's not about that. It's about the expansion of the, if like a redefinition of who Israel is, and the full incorporation of the sojourner, and the expansion of the boundaries of Israel to encompass all sojourners, all Gentiles. And the word that's used here is really, it's almost a technical term for a person who's not an Israelite by birth, but who has who dwells amongst the Israelites in their community. And this explains, therefore, why this man who's an Amalekite, constantly being referred to as an Amalekite, would nevertheless tear his clothes when the king of Israel dies. And therefore, it's perfectly likely that he might have been involved in the battle, and he certainly shouldn't have been there by chance, because he's made. In the same way, we come across another sojourner a little bit later in this book, just a few chapters down the line, Uriah, Bathsheba's first husband, who's always referred to Uriah the Hittite. And the Hittite Empire, I mean, by this time, the Hittite Empire had pretty much been extinguished, but the Hittite Empire was in what we now call Turkey. But it spread east and south also into the what we know in the modern day Syria. And clearly this Uriah, the Hittite, had at some point, either he or his family had moved down and had come to dwell amongst Israelites and was living in Jerusalem with Bathsheba and was in the Israelite army. And so being an Amalekite meant that he was a foreigner by birth. Being a sojourner meant that he was expected to follow the customs of Israel and to know the customs of Israel and to live according to them. So you can't plead ignorance, put it that way. And so David said to him, well, how is it then that you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? If he'd been an Amalekite who was just passing his way from Syria to Egypt and he was just there on Mount Gilboa at the wrong time, that's one thing, but he's a sojourner. He ought to have known better. Given that who you are, how dare you put out your hand against the Lord's anointed, even if he asked for it? Now that's the important thing. The office that Saul has been given is not an absolute monarchy. It's the only absolute monarchy is God's monarchy. God is the only absolute monarch. Saul is the king of Israel. He's the ruler of Israel by divine appointment under divine authority. And therefore, he does not have the right to decree laws or to give commands that contravene God's commands. He can't say, actually, I'm done with this kingship. David, you take over. I'm tired of this. No, you didn't take it on yourself and you don't get to resign. God anointed you. And this is a really, really important principle for understanding how government and governing authority works. Scripture is very clear about government or governing authorities, governments being servants of God to do God's will. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily know that they're God's servants, but they are, and we are to take them as such. And whenever I say this, somebody at some point says, well, what about Hitler? Yeah, that's always the thing that comes back at me. And the answer is, well, what about Hitler? The answer, Hitler was the head of state. And as such, even though he was vehemently anti-Christian, not only in his actions, but also in his attitudes, he was God's servant. Not a very faithful or good one, but he was. And therefore, if you're living in Hitler's Germany, you were not exempt from paying for your train ticket, or stopping at the red light, or paying your taxes, or driving on the same side of the road as the law said. You are not exempt from laws concerning theft and murder because it happened to be Hitler who was took the top seat. Hitler's problem was that he also he assumed greater authority than he had. So he gave laws and orders and commands that contravened God's laws, orders, and commands. And insofar as he did so, they were to be disregarded and opposed by Christians. In the same way that we ought to. There are some, we are horrified by the Holocaust, aren't we?
Yeah.
And the gas vans that they used to kill the disabled. Well, we do exactly the same thing. We kill disabled people in their thousands in this country. We just do it before they're born.
Yeah, that's true.
Over 200,000 people are killed every year in this country. Most of them because their mothers or their fathers or whoever makes the final decision consider it too much of an inconvenience for this child to live. 200,000. How many people died in the Holocaust?
Millions.
6 million. Another 5 million were prisoners of war, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies. 11 million altogether. How many people have died in the United States since abortion was legalized? Over 50 million. That's 5 times the Nazi war. No, that's what it is. So 5 times as many people are being killed in the womb in the States than the Nazis ever killed in their camps.
Just make it right.
No, it doesn't. No. All I'm saying is that it's not just Hitler who's the problem.
No.
You know, when we really have this issue. If when Paul writes to the Romans about the government, the governing authorities being servants of God, the fellow in the top seat is a chap called Nero. Who, if we are to believe contemporary accounts, he kicked his pregnant wife to death, had his own mother murdered, and whether he filled while the Rome burnt or not, which is probably not true, but nevertheless, he wasn't exactly a godly ruler in the mold of David, pre-Bathsheba, not at all. But Paul didn't say, hold your nose and obey the authorities. No, the God's servant. And if you are a Christian ruler, then you are in a particularly privileged and responsible position because you know who you are. You are God's servant. And that hopefully will give you additional tools for being a good ruler, because you know who you are, and to keep you from growing in arrogance and pride, and to keep checks on you. And therefore not do what Saul did, which is resign. He said to his armor bearer, this chap claims that he was Saul who said to him. But if we can only imagine if it did be David having his afternoon saunter on Mount Gilboa, and Saul said, "Oh, David, thrust me through." I'm sure David, from all we've seen so far, who had opportunities to kill Saul twice already, would have said, "Far be from me to put to death the Lord's anointed." And this is again, there's a combination of personal response, the office, the divinely appointed office of which they're office holders, being the actual thing, because that's the thing that God has placed, and then the personal responsibility of the person in that office. And then there's a third thing, which is whatever is owed to that office by those who are under that office. So in the case of Saul, that God anointed him, he established kingship, anointed Saul. Saul had a personal responsibility in that office to carry out the duties of that office as a servant of God. And the people of Israel, on the other hand, were duty bound to honor and to respect and to pay that office, regardless of who was in it. So there's God and there's the office. And then there are 2 kinds of responsibility: the responsibility of the office holder, which God judges on one hand, and then the responsibility of those who are under the office holder, whom God judges on the other hand. And that distinction between the character, the qualities, and the excellence of the office holder and the dignity of the office itself must be kept really clear. In the New Testament, we have the pastoral office, and God has established it. He has given it in, like Ephesians 4 says, God established for the sake of the church. He established apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers for building up the body of Christ. And some people in the pastoral office are just outstandingly wonderful, virtuous people, great, they're great in every way. And you say, has this person got no faults at all? Amazing, And then there are others who are really quite useless at it. But those who are under the office are under the office, not of that person. It's not personal charisma that we are obedient to, because that's a win. No, we are under God's authority, which God has given. And sometimes you get great people in that office. Sometimes you've got mediocre ones, sometimes you've got weak ones. But we look for our rewards from God, not from one another. And when we do that, then we know that we are secure. Israel would have been far better off with somebody other than Saul as king. But the right thing to do, since God had established their kingship, to wait for God to act, which he did in due course. And so David calls one of the young men and says, go and execute him. And he was killed for regicide, for killing the king. Now, surely there should have been an investigation and a court case. No?
They didn't do that then, did they?
That's not the issue. They did. Everything must be established with 2 or 3 witnesses. So why not here? He pleaded guilty. If you're charged with murder and say, yes, I'm guilty, there's no court, there will be no trial, just sentencing. So this is not unjust at all. He volunteered the information. As it happens, doing the right thing often is beneficial. God's law actually brings its own blessings. For example, if you obey, let's say, the 4th commandment, you honor your parents and those in authority over you, it will, on the whole, in the long run, wait long enough and it will work in your favor. Because God's commands are wise and therefore beneficial. Likewise here, doing this was politically expedient for David. Because what he has done by doing this, he has upheld the sanctity of the anointed kingship. If he said, oh, Saul, we didn't like him, that's all right, well done, here's a bag of sweeties, to reward yourself with. The message he would have sent out would have been, if the king's a rotter, you can do away with him. Which would probably not have been very wise for David if he wanted to be king. He wanted everyone else to think, no, the anointed kingship is sacred and must never be touched. And so doing God's will, being mindful of God's will, was also in his own interest. And here's the condemnation. Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I've killed the Lord's anointed. Your blood be on your head. Who else said this? Something similar. Wait, a very famous passage.
Was it Caesar?
No.
Pilatus.
Who?
Pilate. No, it wasn't Pilate. It was said to Pilate by the Jewish, the priests and elders who brought Jesus to Pilate. He says, he washed his hands and said, his blood be on our head and on us and on our children. We will bear responsibility for this death. Your blood be on your head. In other words, you are responsible for your own death, not mine. Notice, by the way, the crown and the bracelet, which have been brought, don't seem to be mentioned at all. And in fact, they're never mentioned again in the whole book. We never hear of them once. So that was a spectacular miscalculation. Whatever trouble he went to get these things to David.
So they weren't used for David's.
We never hear of them again.
Right. He
Never
was
were.
given something else or not?
Wait and see. Wait and see. Okay. So that's that. And now we finally we now get to, we were told a few verses earlier that they wept and lamented, wept and fasted. And so now we hear the content of David's lament. This is one of the earliest, earliest recorded song by David. He lamented this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan, his son. And now this is, we get a slightly tricky verse to translate. So we've got I've got in front of me 3 different translations of the text. One says, he said, verse 18, he said, it should be taught to the people of Judah. Behold, it's written in the book of Jasher. Another one says, and he ordered that the men of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasher. And then a third one that says, and he ordered that it be taught, the song of the bow to the sons of Judah. It is written in the book of the righteous. So we've got no bow, a bow, we've got 2 books of Jasher and a book of the righteous. What on earth is going on? We have the word bow in it. The ESV leaves it out. Have you got the word bow in it, in Carol, in verse 18?
No.
No. So it's been some translations leave it out. It's thought to be a kind of a type of a song, kind of martial song, like a military song. So he literally says, and he said it should be taught to the people of Judah, comma, the bow. That's kind of what's written.
Yeah.
So that's the
David
name of the
wrote
song.
this lament.
This is David's lament, yes. And the book of Jasher, well, Jasher just means righteous.
Oh.
So it's either the book of Jasher, or a person called Jasher, or it's just a book called the Book of the Righteous. And given that it's got David's lament in it, and we don't have the book anymore, it's been lost, long lost. It's got David's lament in it. The only other reference to the book of Jasher, book of righteous, is in Joshua chapter 10. I don't know if you remember, but Joshua asked for a sign from God. And the sign that God sends is the sun stops still in the sky for an hour. The day is extended by an hour, as is recorded in the book of the righteous, the book of Joshua. So given that we know that it's got stories about Joshua and stories about David, both of whom are really, really important precursors of Christ, I would suggest that it's more likely that it's book of the righteous. It's a book that had collections of accounts from the lives of righteous men. But the important thing is the actual lament. Carol, would you mind reading the lament from 19 onwards?
Imagine. Thy glory, O Israel, is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor upsurging of the deep. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you daintily in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? Jonathan lies slain upon thy high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished?
Thank you. Now you know where the phrase "how the mighty have fallen" where it comes from. This is its origin. A lot of our expressions are actually biblical expressions, and obviously it's the key phrase that gets is at the start, in the middle, and at the end. It's in few parts. First, you have the glory of Israel is slain. What is the glory, or the perhaps you could translate it also the beauty or the ornament of Israel, is almost certainly a reference to the kingship and to the king, to the royalty. How the mighty have fallen, the mighty men. This is like the heroes, military heroes have fallen. Reference to the mighty men of Israel, Saul, Jonathan, the other sons, and the valiant men of the army. Then it comes, it's too late because we know that the Philistines already paraded Saul's and Jonathan's body at this point. But tell not in Gath, publishing not in Ashkelon, in the streets of Ashkelon. These are two of the Philistine cities, of the 7 Philistine cities. Of course, Gath is the place where David himself had been. Lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. Remember when the most famous man from Gath, Goliath, was killed. The women of Israel, the daughters of Israel, rejoiced and sang a song. Saul has killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands. So now he's saying, let them not do the same with Saul. And again, we've got, like we had before, there's a little bit of a kind of Saul, a Goliath kind of theme going on. Two tall men, two big men.
Yeah.
Unless the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Referring to them as the uncircumcised is a kind of contemptuous term. So you can see there's David who's been living in Gath and amongst Philistines, speaking of them with this contempt. They are the enemies of God. They're the enemies of God's people. Then he curses Gilboa, the place where David is. Let Mount Gilboa. I mean, it's a sort of, again, this is poetic. This is not a prophetic sort of thing. You know, Gilboa, if you go there now, is perfectly green, just like the rest of the surrounding country. But yes, you know, that this is a place where the shield of the mighty was defiled with blood. That is, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil, or no longer anointed with oil. And so therefore he asked for Gilboa to go, you know, kind of wishes that Gilboa were cursed as a place. No more dew or rain, nor fields or offerings of grain. And then that's the second part. The third part, verse 22, now begins to reminisce about the valor, military valor of Jonathan and Saul. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. These are the mighty men. These are the heroes, if you like. This is the sorts of men they were, these great military, great warriors. And then next, he turns to his own relationship. To their character in their relation with one another. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. It's very, very common in ancient literature to refer to kings and rulers as always being good looking and being sort of handsome. Like in Psalm 45, you are the most handsome of the children of men. In life and in death, they were not divided. Now, this is incredibly generous. Because you remember how Saul tried to pin Jonathan to the wall for not being divided from David. So he's completely erasing the dubious parts of their memory and presenting only what is good. He's essentially keeping the eighth commandment. We should not slander, tell lies by no, betray, slander, but explain everything the kindest way. Put the best construction in everything. He's doing that even beyond the grave. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. And so he calls on all of Israel to weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel, which again suggests, speaks of the success of Saul, which brought prosperity. And then he turns to Jonathan. We've got the refrain, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. So that's kind of end of part one. He speaks of them, in their, if you like, their office, in their role, and the way that they have conducted themselves in public. And now comes the second final part where he speaks of his personal loss. Jonathan lies slain in your high places. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women, which is these days has been often used. This verse has been used to suggest that there was something homoerotic going on between David and Jonathan, which is complete nonsense. He's not saying I love women, but I loved you even more in that some kind of romantic or erotic way. Rather, what he's suggesting is that his friendship, Jonathan's friendship, was the most precious relationship he had. And we talked about this before, the kind of the whole phenomenon of male friendship that has been to a large degree lost in our culture in the last 100 years or so. But yeah, so David and Jonathan, they were like close, like brothers, the closest relationship there was. And of course, in that kind of society where a relationship between husbands and wives was often quite formal, and there were some very, very strict social rules about relationships between men and women who were not married to each other. That meant that very often your kind of closest friendship would have been with other men if you're married. and it's perfectly normal. What you would expect, that's what happens. If you're not allowed, if you are in a sort of expedient or marriage or in an arranged marriage where you don't necessarily have a deep friendship with your spouse, you love them, you can love your spouse without having a kind of really close bond, a friendship bond, and you can't really befriend other women. Then what's left are the men. So your closest friendships would be with people of with other men. And so this is not, to us that might sound odd, but it's not at all. We have, a lot of these social customs are broken down in our time, so it's perfectly normal. Now, we don't think anything funny about a man having a friendship with a woman who's not his wife. Although I think you ought to be careful with it, even in our day, but yes.
These three women sat here with you either, because the women were always outside.
Well, they were in the Christian church, women were involved from the very beginning.
The Christian church, but
yeah.
So I think that's where a lot of that came from. But in those days,
you did have a separation of spheres, yes.
Yes.
You had the kind of women's quarters and men's quarters. You're absolutely right. Yes. I would nevertheless suggest that if to wives, if their husbands spend a lot of time with their best mate who happens to be a woman, that they probably ought to be just keeping an eye on them, because these social customs exist for a reason. They weren't just kind of uninformed, old-fashioned, unenlightened ignorance. They were actually based on a pretty realistic understanding of human nature. This is why you hear so often you hear of say Hollywood actors or actresses' marriages breaking up, and they go off with somebody else because they made a film together and they spent 6 months on a set playing husband and wife, and funnily enough something happened. It's not sometimes these old things they came with, there were problems, but I think there's wisdom in there as well. How the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war have perished.
What does that mean?
The weapons of war.
It's not perished, because it carries on, doesn't it?
No, but it means it's sort of, again, the weapons of war. It doesn't mean that they haven't got any swords left. It's more to do with, again, the army has been defeated and destroyed, and they have lost a lot of.
For a while.
Yeah, for the time being. Yeah, so this is the situation as David is speaking. It's highly rhetorical, it's poetic. We shouldn't try to read this as whenever anybody ever asks you, do you believe the Bible is literally true? I hope you say no. Because it's a stupid question. It's a completely ignorant question. So it's not supposed to be. Some of it's literally true. Some of it isn't supposed to be. When he says, "Awake, O harp and lyre, I will awake the dawn." Is that literally true? When did you last awake the dawn? When did you last hear a harp and a lyre? Well, it's not supposed to be literally true. It's poetry. Is the book of Revelation literally true? Well, it's not literally true. It's true. It's just not literally true. It's true in a different way. Are the parables of Jesus literally true? Is the Good Samaritan literally true? No. Well, did it happen? Well, no, it didn't happen. Is it therefore false? No, it's not false. It's a different kind of, there are more truths than literal truths. When I say I was really starving yesterday because I missed my lunch, was I? No, that wasn't literally true. But I wasn't lying. It's just a way of speaking. I was really hungry. No, it didn't actually happen. I did have lunch yesterday, but these are, and this, when we come to poetry like this, which are, are there no weapons left in Israel? Of course there are. He's making a point. It's a lamentation, not a catalogue or inventory.
It's really talking about the weapons used by them in particular, isn't it?
Yes, and it's a sort of, this is the impact. It's like, David saw the finest fighters of Israel have died. It's like, we've lost our army.
Yeah.
Well, they haven't. They'll be fighting war soon enough.
Yeah.
And this sets the scene. So this is the hinge on which the whole story turns. Saul is gone. And David's there. Now, David doesn't immediately become a king of Israel, as we'll discover, and it takes some years before the situation settles down, and that is what the next few chapters will be dealing with that.
What would the age be of David at this time?
It's quite difficult actually to tell, because the time indicators are so vague. But I would suggest that he's in his 30s at this point. But it's difficult to tell exactly but yeah, that would be my suggestion. That he's in his 30s because he's king for about 40 years from here.
Oh, right. So he was very old in some parts of it, wasn't it? Some parts he's fairly old in the reading.
Well, at the end of his life, he is old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Still, I know, but it's apparent then, isn't it?
Yes.
Later on.
Yeah. Again, it's wait and see.
Mm.
We'll hopefully get there by Christmas.
Oh,
No guarantees though.
is it that long then?
Anyway, any final questions or comments on that? We've slightly overrun. Well, we haven't overrun. We just started late, so we started late, finished late. I hope that whet your appetite for the rest of the book.
Yes.
It's as we have had with 1 Samuel. It's on the one hand, there's a lot of like straightforward history, but all of it is deep with meaning. Very final thing then to point out. Always the question is, where's Jesus in all this? And here again we have David pleading for the good reputation of a bad man and lamenting the death of an unrighteous man. God says much later through the prophet Ezekiel, I desire not the death of the sinner, but that he repent and live. And so that might become a more realistic prospect than he was, God sent his son into the world to make the righteous righteous, to bring the sinners to repentance, so that we might not die but might live. And we see this sort of literally a violent zeal that David had for God's will. And Jesus too had the same violent zeal for God's will, not only violent when he cleansed the temple, but he was willing to endure violence that God's will be done while we remain unharmed. And we will see this sort of theme growing as we go. But let's close with prayer. Father, we thank you that you have given us something even better than a righteous King David, that your Son, Jesus Christ, the perfect Son of the Virgin Mary, your eternal Son, is our King, to whom you have given all authority in heaven and on earth. Grant us grace always to live under him in his kingdom in everlasting righteousness, innocence and blessedness, until we are brought to the glory which he has and which he has promised all who love him. Guide your church throughout the world and bring more and more sinners to repentance, to enjoy the eternal life that Jesus won for us by his death and his resurrection. Keep us with the whole church, and may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.
Amen.